Hello, and welcome to the first City Island Nautical Museum Winter Web Series event. I'm so excited to be here tonight and to be opening up our virtual doors for a conversation with the Vice President and Administrator of the Nautical Museum, Barbara Dolensek, and the President of the Hart Island Project, Melinda Hunt. They have a great slideshow and conversation in store for us. And then after that, we're going to have time for question and answers. So I hope that everyone is excited as I am for this conversation. And without further ado, Barbara and Melinda, please come on as well.
Hello, Lauren.
Hi. Yeah, Lauren,
Hi.
I think there we go. You need to start the video for us.
Okay.
Okay. Oh, start my video. Okay. Here we are.
Okay. Yeah, here we are. Okay. I'd like to do a little bit of an introduction so that everybody will know, because I do history, but also to give a little background on Melinda too, who's the most interesting person on the show tonight. Officially named City Cemetery, Hart Island, which is in the eastern Bronx, New York, next to City Island, is the largest public cemetery and the second largest cemetery in the United States. Hart Island has functioned as New York City's public burial ground for more than 150 years, and more than 1 million bodies are estimated to be buried there. New York City does not cremate unclaimed human remains. Unclaimed simply means that a funeral director was not retained for any reason. It doesn't mean that the decedent was indigent, unloved, or without friends. All burials on Hart Island are now with family consent. New York City purchased Hart Island in 1868, and in 1869 adopted a system of burials consisting of burial plots with 150 graves, first used during the Civil War for burying Union soldiers. This system is highly organized and efficient. It permits the city to bury 25 bodies an hour while keeping track of each individual grave for at least 25 years. City Cemetery has been managed by an agency created in 1866, the Department of Public Charities and Correction. This agency split in 1895 with both Correction and Charities, now the Human Resource Administration, remaining on the administrative code until 2019. Starting in July 2021, HRA, the Human Resource Administration, will take over full control of the burials, and New York City Parks will manage visitation and maintain the landscape of the island. Hart Island is notable as the largest natural burial facility in the United States and the only natural cemetery within the 5 boroughs. The burial process predates the widespread use of cremation and embalming. Graves on public land can be reused as grave sites after 25 years, and most of the intact graves date back to the AIDS epidemic. After a century and a half, the city cemetery represents a cost-effective, sustainable system of municipal burials and an important natural and historic site for present and future generations of Americans. However, it has been very difficult for the public to access Hart Island and obtain information about burials on the island and to enjoy this remote and beautiful landscape. The Hart Island Project began in 1991 at the height of the AIDS epidemic as an effort to rephotograph Jacob Rice's first images for his centennial book, How the Other Half Lives. Following the publication of a book of photographs in 1998 called Hart Island with photographer Joel Sternfeld and the 2007 documentary Hart Island, an American Cemetery with jazz composer Fred Hirsch, families began to contact Melinda Hunt, who had started the project, for assistance in locating the graves of relatives buried there. This led to a Freedom of Information request for 50,000 burial records and the incorporation of the Hart Island Project as a nonprofit organization in 2011. Since December 2019, when the City Council transferred jurisdiction of the island to the Department of Parks and Recreation, organization has begun a campaign to have Hart Island designated a national monument. In July 2020, the New York City Council introduced legislation to form a commission to explore a COVID-19 memorial. The number of burials on Hart Island tripled when the pandemic hit New York City. Fortunately, the historic burial process has been used in many earlier epidemics and is easily scalable and a safe, affordable option for New York City residents who succumbed to the virus. I'd like to introduce you to the president of the Hart Island Project and an expert on almost every aspect of the island, I believe now, right? Melinda, would you say so? Would you agree?
People seem to come to me with information about it, so I have at least some of it, but I will say that the city is now putting quite a lot of work into exploring Hart Island as a natural resource and as a public cemetery. So I think it's only going to get better from here. And naturally, it is a very active cemetery during this COVID-19 period. So for everybody who's watching, surely by the end of this pandemic, you will know somebody buried there. So I'm going to do a screen share now and show you some slides that will largely just go over what Barbara was talking about, just with some illustrations. And then if you have a question, you can post it in the question and answered, and then Lauren will come back at the end. Barbara and I will have some discussion and we'll answer some of your questions. Okay, so here we go. And okay. Please do raise your hand and let Lauren know if you're unable to see the screen. So this first image is a drone video that we took in 2017 of Hart Island in August. It is really a beautiful location. I'm sure all of you on City Island are very familiar with Hart Island and are anxious to be able to stop off when you're out and about and be able to visit. Unfortunately, I don't think it's going to be open for some time to come. So I've been working with a historian from UC Berkeley, Thomas LeCure, and he's wrote a book called the Work of the Dead, and it explains really how this cemetery came about and how it fits into the culture. And Hart Island it's interesting to me. I'm a visual artist. It's interesting to me because there's no other cemetery in the United States that is at all like Hart Island. It's a really unique place in our landscape, and that is why we've begun this discussion of whether or not it should be become a national monument with so that the city would have some support and interpretation from the National Park Service. Okay, now let me see if I can, there, next thing. And also the other historian who knows a lot about this is Ken Jackson, who many of you may know from Columbia, who published a book called Silent Cities. And he photographed out on Hart Island and has visited. And this is just a photograph that just shows early morning on Hart Island with the sun coming up, and really what a beautiful landscape it is. And this particular area is an area that has been cleared of buildings and will be used probably starting next year, just depending on how quickly the prior area fills up with bodies. So this is a photograph of early April, which happened to be the next to last day of inmates performing the burials on Hart Island. Since April 1869, for 151 years continuously, prison labor was used to conduct the burials. but this image is literally one of the very last days. And what happened was the city basically ran out of inmate labor because due to the closing of Rikers Island and also inmates becoming sick, as well as correction officers becoming sick, they just ran out of labor. And so the Parks Department issued a contract for landscapers to take over the burial process. But here you can see the burial process that has been used all along of 150 per grave. There are 3 sections of 50 boxes per section, and there are 2 rows, and the boxes are 3 deep. And so it's a very carefully laid out grid. And that's important because the city needs to be able to keep track of every single body. Every box is technically a grave. And then within a plot, there are 150 adults. And so then we go back to, this is the first public visit in July 2015. And the experience of going to one of these open graves in an area where the landscape isn't very well managed is traumatizing for families, really. If you go to the earlier slide where it's all beautiful and you don't see these open graves, it's a totally different experience than if your relative was buried relatively recently. And so then you move on. So this was happened to be on Palm Sunday of 2019, a beautiful day, and a woman visiting with her child. And this location is where her dad was buried. She was about 11 years old when her dad died, and she didn't get to visit until 2019. And this is what the gravesite looked like in 1993 when her father Norberto was buried. So you can see the landscape. It does heal relatively quickly, and they no longer use these concrete markers per grave. They use plastic pipes, but really they could do it completely with GPS and not have any markers, which would make Hart Island fully a natural burial ground and the largest in the country. So here's the sense of scale. So that one location where she put her flowers, that's the spot where her father his grave actually is within a plot of 150. So then going back to the Civil War, this is the only known illustration of that time period. And it shows the tremendous number of buildings that were up on the north end. There were 3,412 Confederate soldiers who were there as prisoners of war, but the Union Army had planned, if the war had kept going, to have 10,000 Confederate soldiers imprisoned there. So it was a fairly large scale operation. So then because we're in COVID-19, we're really going to focus sort of on the history of the burials themselves. And so the first time really since Marathon in Greece, the common soldier was acknowledged in death. That's what the dedication of the National Cemetery at Gettysburg. The Gettysburg Address was actually the dedication of that cemetery. And it was an attempt to honor the common soldier and make his sacrifice to his country honorable. And the layout of the cemetery, as you can see, is again, without too many monuments. The soldiers are all buried in their units. And so that's a kind of community which is similar to these common plots that you have on Hart Island, where you will have a number of bodies that are all in one grave. And the system of burials on Hart Island was developed to be able to quickly bury Union soldiers on the battlefield such that they could disinter them and move them to national cemeteries later on. And that process is well documented in Drew Gilpin-Faust's book, This Republic of Suffering, where she goes over, how they developed the system of burials and the fact that they frequently used United States colored troops who were segregated in the Civil War to bury the dead. So here's a photograph of the Civil War, this process that went on for many years after the war of disinterring these graves using this burial method and then reburying them, either sending the bodies home to their families or burying them in national cemeteries. And this is just this photograph and this photograph that we took during the AIDS epidemic are somewhat similar. Incarcerated African-American men were primarily the grave diggers on Hart Island. And these are just, I'm continuing with quotes from Drew Gilpin-Faust. In a gesture that was at once practical and punitive, officers often ordered prisoners of war to bury their own dead. And what I found when I was working with inmates and I interviewed them is they had lost a friend or a relative who had been buried on Hart Island. And when they agreed to work on the burial detail, they in fact felt like they were burying their own dead. So then, following the Civil War, the U.S. Sanitary Commission was embedded at Bellevue Hospital, and the Sanitary Commission introduced the system of photographing the dead and documenting the position of each grave within a common plot in ledgers. And New York City adopted new sanitary codes in 1866 that involved, basically the law was that you couldn't open any new burial grounds in Manhattan. They created the Department of Charities and Correction, which controlled all the healthcare institutions as well as the penal institution, the branch workhouse on Hart Island, which was part of the workhouse on what is now Roosevelt Island. It remained open until 1966. So this burial practice was adopted from the Civil War and has served New York City for a very long time. And so there's something about it that really works for the city, and that is that they can scale up very quickly during a pandemic. There were many epidemics in New York City. They can bury 25 bodies in an hour, and it's a very efficient system of burials, so you don't run out of space very quickly. And so that's what's become very important once again during COVID-19. So this is the original ledgers. When they started the burials, they didn't quite have the system in place. It didn't really begin until 1872. And this is the first ledger book where they're writing down the place of death, the smallpox hospital, which again was on Roosevelt Island, Bellevue Hospital, the lunatic asylum, the charity hospital. All of these public institutions were places where during periods of epidemics, and this in the 1870s, there was a lot of yellow fever. You could lose, huge portions of the population in one season. So City Cemetery, as it was called, they retired the name Potter's Field on Ward's Island, was a planned cemetery organized into grids and paths with paths between the mass graves. And it was meant to be like the other rural cemeteries in Greenwood and Woodlawn, to be a rural cemetery except without monuments. And it's about the same age as Woodlawn Cemetery, which opened in 1863. So this is a photograph by Jacob Riis, which was the inspiration for starting the Hart Island Project, looking at something about New York City that had not changed in 100 years, and then revisiting Hart Island using the same type of camera, a large view camera, to photograph the burials out there. And the advantage of using the land camera was that we could only take 1 or 2 photographs in a day. And so we were out there for really 3 years photographing it, because you can't shoot very fast with one of these big cameras. And also the Department of Correction got used to us, and they couldn't sort of boss us around too quickly, because we'd have to pick up this giant camera to move it. So we had one rule, and that was that if they sounded the siren, we were supposed to pack up and come back to the dock. So that was the rule. I was permitted to take a vehicle over there and drive around, and we really had free reign of the island, except we weren't allowed into the buildings. So then there's another photograph, and a photograph from during the AIDS epidemic of what it looked like in the trenches. The boxes, they write on them with magic marker, but they also carve the number of the grave on top of the box and on the side. And when they go to do a disinterment, normally they will go in through the side and remove a body without disturbing the rest of the bodies in the trench. And the city still goes back 25 years to do these disinterments. So this is a copy of the ledger page from that one day when we were photographing in February 1992. And this was a photograph of one of the inmates. Many of the inmates were very mindful of the task that they were performing, and many of them were saying prayers and whatnot while it was being conducted. Maybe they were doing that for the camera, I don't know, but it didn't seem as though they were taking it lightly. So the adolescent unit that was on Hart Island closed in 1966, moved to Rikers Island, and it's just recently been closed with the federal human rights violation charges came down in 2014. This is a copy of some of the writings that I collected from inmates working on Hart Island. And this man, Eddie Melendez, writes about his baby sister, who he found out after he started working there that she had been buried there. And so it was very meaningful for him to be able to perform these burials, especially of the babies. This is a mass grave for infants. The infants are very rarely disinterred. So there's 1,000 infants per grave, and they just put them in order. So each box has a number, and it is put in that order. And when they get to 1,000, they close the grave and move on. Then this is a photograph from 2019, a drone photograph showing a partially open infant grave in the lower right-hand corner. And you can imagine, if you were a woman who had recently lost a baby, that to be taken to this site with a building that's in that kind of condition, very near the open mass grave of your baby. These graves take like 3 years to close, that would be very disturbing. And so whenever I'm speaking to people about historic preservation, I tend to want to focus on the preserving the burial process, which is important to city, but not so much the buildings, because they really are disturbing to the family members when they visit. New York City is commissioning environmental safety studies of the buildings to figure out how to remove them safely. And Barbara worked on an application to the State Historic Preservation Office a few years ago that made Hart Island, it's pre-approved as a National Historic Site. And so the city now has to be very mindful of, if they remove these buildings, how do they then tell the history of this location and the workhouse without the buildings being there. So there will be an archaeologist employed. They're going to do ground penetrating radar of all of the known graves so they know where they are. And then they're going to figure out, how does the city continue to bury on Hart Island? Will they reuse graves? Will they add soil to raise up the land so they can start burying on top? All of that work is about to begin with a big contract to make it safe for visitors to return to Hart Island. So then this is just a list of key dates. 1895, when the new city charter, company consolidation of the boroughs and Department of Charities and Corrections split into separate agencies. It was also the same time that City Island would have become part of the Bronx in New York City. Both agencies remain on the administrative code, but HRA was inactive, and now they're taking over all of the management of the burials with a new Office of Burial Services. The workhouse closed on Hart Island, but the city continued to use inmate labor up until today. For 50 years, the Parks Department refused to accept jurisdiction, and they just accepted it in December 2019. And HRA is planning to issue a 3-year contract to a cemetery company. Almost all private cemeteries use contracted labor to manage the burials. And HRA, as I said, is separately contracting an environmental study to determine how to safely remove the burials and create additional capacity for city burials going forward. And this is just a shot of, this is the very oldest monument on Hart Island. It was a monument to 2 boys who were part of the Nautical school ship program that was run by the city, and 2 of them drowned. And newspaper accounts have described this cross made of river stones that are painted white, and the 2 boys supposedly were buried in the quadrants of this cross. So that's something with the ground penetrating radar. I'm really anxious to find out if those bodies are still there. Those would be the oldest intact burials on Hart Island that we know of. So with that, I'll turn it back to Barbara for discussion.
Okay. The buildings were originally run by the Department of Charities and Correction, right? By the Charities section?
They were built by the Department of Charities and Correction.
Right. Most of them built during the 1880s or so. I know there were several different hospitals and
most were 20th century, but the pavilion is 1885. That's the women's insane asylum.
Right.
And the city stopped, all the asylums closed as the state took over mental health with consolidation. The city did such a poor job managing asylums that the state took over. So that would, it was from really 1885 to 1895 that operated as the pavilion, as the women's insane asylum. And after that, it was just part of the workhouse.
Yeah, right, exactly. The city has used it for other things than burials, all of which have gone away, especially, I believe, during the Second World War, also the First World War, I think. There were some military occupation of the island because it was, presumably perceived as being a danger point for New York City with people, with enemy coming down Long Island Sound, right?
Yeah, they intercepted German U-boats out in the Sound,
And I believe imprisoned some Germans,
They always had the burials going on, though, with all of these other things that more closely tracked the changing culture. This is the one thing that has been continuously connected to Bellevue. I mean, essentially, the morgue at Bellevue and Hart Island are the two parts of this whole process that are still in their original location, performing their original function.
And will continue to be so.
And will continue to be
which
so.
is great. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, so there, I know that, well, can you explain what happened during the pandemic of 1918? How many bodies perhaps were buried there? Was it as bad as this time, or is this not as bad?
Well, I actually went, they have in the ledgers that are at the municipal archives, they have year-end totals. And I haven't looked at them recently, but what I recall was that it was over 20,000 burials in 1918. I mean, it was a
In
massacre.
1918.
Yeah, it was a massacre.
Yeah,
But, you know, earlier than that, the Potter's Field at Madison Square, yellow fever in 1794 wiped out 20% of the population of New York City. I
yeah.
mean,
Well, a
20%
lot
of
of
the
people, I think,
population. So it filled
yeah,
in a year and a half. That
yeah,
entire park was all burials and beyond, and it filled in a year and a half. So what's different about Hart Island is they're not individual graves, and they have this grid structure that's very secure, so you don't lose track of bodies.
mhm,
And it's actually during a pandemic a safer choice than a private funeral director, because the funeral directors, as we saw last spring, become overwhelmed and
overwhelmed,
their
yeah.
backlogs and bodies are stuck in different rooms, whereas the city actually set up these morgue trucks, freezer trucks in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, and they were able to really keep track of every single body and keep them there until the families
Mhm.
have a chance to make a decision one way or another as to what they want to do. And, you know, there are still over 500 bodies in those freezer trucks. Most of those bodies are going to Hart Island because people aren't getting any wealthier, and you would
Yeah,
have already done whatever
mhm,
you were going to do with a funeral director at this
right,
point. So what we're trying to do is to destigmatize the burial process, explain it to people, and to help them feel that they're going to be part of a really wonderful park.
yeah.
And it's a really historic place. And the city of New York does a good job with this.
I know that the use of DNA to identify people has changed things over time, right? Where they used to bury people without knowing who they were, and now there are probably fewer burials, except for obviously for the pandemic. Is that true?
There are, it's about, I think 6% are unidentified.
Mm-hmm,
That was last year. I'm sure it's not that many now because they've scaled up the operation quite a bit, but it
mm-hmm,
changed. They went back and they took DNA samples of all the burials from the 90s. Once you have these national databases, with DNA and whatnot, the medical examiner got a big grant from the Department of Justice to collect DNA from all unidentified bodies so that, in fact, they can do these matches before they disinter.
uh-huh.
So that changed. But the system of photographing and fingerprinting and whatnot, I mean, the
Same.
photographing began during the Civil War. The
Yeah,
Union
interesting.
Army used photography
Mm-hmm,
to, and they talk about there was what was called a dead house in Manhattan. It's still at the same location on 26th Street. And the public at that time were invited to come and view photographs of the dead so they could find their relatives before they went to Hart Island. So it
mm-hmm.
was a more open process then. Now you go in and you give a cheek swab. But
Ah,
before that, the public was invited to come look through the windows at the bodies and try to collect their dead. And I think, and again, we want this process to be more transparent so that people can more readily find their relatives buried on Hart Island. And that's part of what the Hart Island Project has done with our online database
mhm.
to, you know, to try and put these records out there so that people can figure out what happened. Because it's, you know, if you were a child and a parent disappeared, it's a very different experience learning that your mother died versus believing for a period of time that she abandoned you. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just a really important thing for people to know.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. During the AIDS crisis, I know that the burials took place in a different part of the island, which is now considered to have not been necessary and probably demeaning. Can you give more background on that? Is that true?
So starting from about 1984 to 1987, the Department of Correction became worried about that bodies of people who had the AIDS virus, that those bodies might be contagious. And so they were concerned about putting them in these common graves, what would happen if they had to open up those graves to do disinterments. So they moved them to the south end of Hart Island and buried them as deep as they could go in individual graves for a period of time. And by 1987, the bodies of people who died of AIDS were then buried in the common graves. So we don't know who those 30 or so that were buried on the south end of Hart Island early in the AIDS epidemic, but most of the AIDS burials are in the numbered plots with everybody else.
Yeah,
because the AIDS epidemic, the peak didn't happen until 1989, 1990, where the numbers really went up. So it was just a period of time in which the Department of Correction just came up with their own system for doing it. They weren't instructed to bury them separately by the medical examiner. They were just fearful for themselves and for the inmates.
Looking ahead a little bit, I know obviously with climate change and the rise in flood levels, this must be a concern for the future. Hart Island did suffer considerable damage during Hurricane Sandy, and for which a certain amount of federal funds was made available to help restore the northeast end of the island, as I recall. You know more about this. Is this something where we have to be concerned about tidal or by the rising tides, the rising waters around the island?
So I mean, all of the coastal areas of New York City
right. City Island, of course, being
affected by sea level rise. The shoreline restoration is now complete. They're just cleaning up the landscape. So there will no longer be bones washing into the Long Island Sound and showing up on Orchard Beach or at City Island and whatnot, which is what was happening. And so that work is done pretty much. And so now that's part of this burial capacity study, is to figure out how to address these issues of flooding, which parts of the island should the city be burying, with concern for sea level rise, and which areas shouldn't they be? Because there are higher parts of Hart Island, and those areas are all older burials now, and the city can legally recycle graves or bury on top of existing graves. They don't have to disinter after 30 years. So all of that land is now open for reburial, and that's very high ground. So that could certainly happen, and there aren't any buildings in those areas either. So it's all about managing the land and managing Hart Island as a natural burial ground that should be a credit to the city, because it's much better for the environment than concrete vaults, embalming, cremation. None of those things are good for the environment, but just putting the body in the ground the way the city does is actually very ecologically sustainable.
I know that there have been some people on City Island that were sort of objecting to the transfer from the correction department to the parks department, for some reason believing that this would become a park, which is of course not in a traditional sense a park at all, any more than Woodlawn is a park. The idea of treating this like a a serious cemetery, one of the most respectable cemeteries really in the city. I mean, a lot of people don't realize that Bryant Park behind the library and Washington Square Park, those were all Potter's Fields, and that's why there are no buildings on them, right? That this is respected territory, and I think that Hart Island deserves the same, if not more, the same kind of respect.
Well, New York City or New York State requires that if any cemetery in the state, private cemetery becomes insolvent, that the municipality take it over and honor the deeds. So literally any cemetery in New York City could become parkland. That's an automatic thing. And so if the cemetery were to close on Hart Island, it would be just the city park like every other city park. So I think that what people on City Island were advocating for was to keep Hart Island as a cemetery. And that's what we want to do. And obviously during a pandemic, that's what we need.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it's going to be difficult to get funding to remove the buildings in a safe way? I'm sure asbestos, there's plenty of not nice substances in the area. This is being studied, as you said, by an archaeologist now to figure out how this can happen.
The city will hire a team, which
Mm-hmm.
will be our archaeologists, an architect, a landscape architect, structural engineer, geologist, all of that to conduct studies whereby the city can make decisions as to what to do. But
Mm-hmm.
what we anticipate will be quite expensive is if the buildings are full of loose asbestos,
Yeah.
it's quite expensive to dispose of contaminated debris, and it's illegal in New York State to bury bodies in rubble. It has to be clean dirt. And so some of the engineering firms that are looking at it are familiar with how do you do this, and the city will have to contract. I mean, it's work that should have been done long ago. But I think what's happened with COVID-19 is it's come into focus how important city cemetery is to the city, that you have to have a place to put the bodies.
Yeah.
And during the 1918 flu epidemic, Philadelphia ran out of burial space. All the other cities ran out of burial space, but New York City didn't, because they have a system of burials that actually works, that actually is responsive to this problem and is scalable.
And it still works.
It's 150 years later and we haven't
Yeah.
run out of burial space because
Mm-hmm.
the system works. And so we already own the land. We're already burying people out there. What we need to do is make it safe for visitors, because that's what the class action lawsuit determined, that the public has a right to visit Hart Island. And so there was a period of time between starting with the AIDS epidemic until 2015 that it was that you couldn't go to a grave site. And that all changed with the New York Civil Liberties Union lawsuit. So that's
the Hart Island,
federal law.
Your Hart Island project had an enormous amount to do with it. I don't think it would have happened without you trying to get information available to people who wanted or who suspected that their relatives were buried there.
Yes, we petitioned the Department of Correction to provide access for women to visit the graves of their babies. And the city
And you also did a lot of records.
City agreed
too.
to that. And the records are extremely important. We're still having, once again this year, having difficulty getting the ledgers from the city, the actual ledgers. They just gave us a printout of their database, and then there's things that are missing in their database. It's very important to have, it's better for everyone to have two completely separate databases, because all databases have errors. And so if the same information is looked at by two completely separate entities, then chances are you know, it'll be correctly listed in one or the other, that we won't make all the same mistakes. But in giving us a printout of their database, then we're sort of consigned to duplicating mistakes that are in the city
Right.
database. And that's not a good thing to do. So we're still trying to get the GPS information as well as the burial ledgers.
Right, but your website, which everybody should be visiting for more information and just to see the photographs and all the history. It's really a fascinating trip to take, especially if you can't leave your house.
Yes, and we will have the COVID-19 data in the database by the end of the month.
Yeah.
So through August, all we've got is through August 20th,
Uh-huh.
but huge number of burials this year.
Yeah.
And yeah, and you know, we're working on trying to get the GPS information so they won't appear on the map that we have on our homepage if we don't have the GPS data. So I mean, we were getting it, and then they saw, I mean, there's always confusion in a transition between agencies. So
but
so
you're tracking all of that to
we
help
have a
them
law
through.
firm that does this for us, and
Yeah,
it's difficult, you know, because the city is, you know, is shut down somewhat and everyone's working from home. So
yeah.
so we have to have some tolerance, but really we requested these records last February, and the city's supposed to be responsive within 6 weeks to FOIL requests.
Well,
So
good luck with that.
a year is long enough. Yeah, we need to
Okay.
get them.
I see there are some questions that have come up. Lauren, do
Yeah.
you want to sort of
Let's go to
sift through them?
questions.
Sure, yeah, I put them together in some kind of an order, so.
Oh, good for you. Yeah.
So the first one, Melinda, is can you just go through the buildings on the island and if the island was ever home to people?
Okay. Yeah, there were up to, you know, around 2,000 people living on Hart Island. The people who worked there lived there. The doctor who was in charge of the asylum lived there. Nurses lived there. There were all kinds of medical staff and correction officers and people who worked there who lived out there. Many people who lived on City Island worked on Hart Island, and children whose parents worked on Hart Island went to school on City Island. So there was that exchange. Um, if anybody on, you know, on this would like a copy of, we have a new, the Historic District Council published a historic guide, and I can send you a copy if you want to fill out the contact form with your address and whatnot. I can mail you a copy of that. So
Very
I
useful
can't,
little booklet.
in terms of going over the buildings, even since we created this guide, it came out last year, already some of the buildings are gone. So they won't be there for that much longer, is my guess, because they're unstable and it's dangerous for the public to view, and the Parks Department doesn't want to just fence them off. They want to remove them, although they might leave the pavilion to go to ruins. I don't think those decisions are fully.
And there's also a nice chapel. Yeah.
Yeah, the chapel. Yeah, we'll see what I mean, it just depends if they're very dangerous.
Yeah.
What the engineers advise the city, because, you know, we wouldn't want for a brick to fall on somebody. And the parks, there's no way they can secure the island, so we have to make it safe as a parkland, and it's easier to do that as a wilderness area than it is to have buildings out there.
Can you talk through the process of someone who wants to visit the island now, and then potentially what access might look like with new ownership?
Right now, you can't visit. That's what the DOC website says. I'm assuming that there will be information on the Human Resource Administration website or the Parks Department. I'm not exactly sure how. I know all the agencies are working together, and it's being managed out of the Office of the Mayor. It's being coordinated by the Office of the Mayor. So that's what's happening. As you know, the Parks Department has had a severe budget cut and whatnot. So I think it's an emergency contact through the Human Resource Administration that is taking over the burials.
Yeah.
So we just don't know how it may be closed for a period of time while they address these environmental issues out there. That's my guess.
Okay. Can you explain the process for trying to find a family member who might have been buried on Hart Island?
Yeah, you just go to our website, and it just depends how recent that person was buried. So our website goes back to 1980. If you want to find somebody earlier than that, then it's the Department of Records and Information, the municipal archives, that has those ledgers. And the easiest way to really find someone is to first determine their date of death. And so Social Security is often the place where people figure that out. Then you can order a death certificate if it's before 1945 from the municipal archives. If it's after 1945, or I guess it's moving to 1950, then it is the Department of Health, vital statistics. You can go online and order a death certificate, and they'll search for about 2 years. But it's way better if you know the date of death before you apply for a death certificate, plus it costs money. And also municipal archives, I think there's a fee as well. So it just depends on how far back.
All right. And then the last one that I have noted here is, who provides the boxes, and are they biodegradable? And if not, how is that ecologically sound?
The boxes are biodegradable, and they do biodegrade. So if you look at Hart Island on Google Earth, you can see that the area in the center of the island where the older burials are, it's all hillocky, and that's because the boxes have collapsed, and the bodies are on top of one another, and so you get a depression, which you can actually see from satellite photos. And then part of what we're exploring is more biodegradable body bags for the medical examiner. That would be helpful, not to send plastic bags out there. Other than that, the city doesn't embalm, so it really is a completely natural burial ground.
And then I have another one here since I started questioning.
Oh, wait a minute, there was another part of that question. Who provides them?
Yes, yeah.
Right now, I think the inmates make them, but the city in the past did purchase them from a crate company in Long Island called Abbott and Abbott. Whether or not they'll go back to purchasing them from Abbott and Abbott or another contractor, I don't know.
You really do know it all.
I know.
Yeah.
Amazing, huh?
So someone wants to know, how active has the City Island community been in propelling or stalling the development of Hart Island into a usable and accessible land for the public?
Because Hart Island was purchased, it was really part of Pelham the same way City Island was, part of Westchester. It really, its first public use was by the Union Army. And so it was accessed from the east, and it really had nothing to do with City Island at that point. So what we're talking about tonight is this burial process, which was adopted by the Department of Charities and Correction because the Sanitary Commission was at Bellevue Hospital helping them to deal with all of the health issues that came out of the Civil War. There were a lot of injured veterans in New York City and whatnot. So it really always has been more connected to Bellevue than it has to City Island. So it was really part of New York City before the Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, or Staten Island. Mm-hmm. It was in Westchester, but owned by the city of New York in 1869. So it was really more tied to New York County than it is to the Bronx historically.
But have any of the residents of City Island either what were you going to say, Barbara?
Oh, well, I was just going to say that residents of City Island have been concerned about Hart Island for years, not so much because of the cemetery, but because the New York City has tried to put there a number of things that are not, that people on City Island were very concerned about. There was going to be a large boat with homeless people on it. There was going to be a some kind of not a crematorium, but some kind of a power structure of some sort to create. I don't remember, Melinda, do you remember exactly what it was that the city?
Well,
We all worked against it and it didn't happen and they all went away, but
they were trying to open the prison system was exploding in
yeah,
the 80s, and
prison barge.
the Department of Correction realized it was a mistake that they moved. I mean,
Mhm.
Mayor Beam ordered Phoenix House to close.
Yeah,
And in doing that,
You want to explain?
that's a drug rehabilitation.
yeah, what happened was they closed the workhouse, but then the Rockefeller drug laws passed. And so they started processing people convicted of addiction at Rikers Island and sending them to reside on Hart Island as part of Phoenix House. That's how Phoenix House got started. But then during the fiscal crisis in the 70s, it became the most expensive part of operating Hart Island has been the ferry service, which is Department of Transportation. And it was very expensive to have people living out there because you needed 24/7 ferry service so you could get them off the island. So they just suddenly closed it in 1976 without really a plan. And that it immediately became an area where vandals were frequently the island and destroying the buildings and
Doing a lot
whatnot.
of damage.
It was a big mistake, actually, to do that so drastically, but it was a fiscal crisis, so that's what happened with Mayor Beam. And so then Department of Correction, it was their property, and they wanted to, first of all, during the Koch administration, they had a quality of life workhouse out there where inmates would live there, and their job was going to be to restore the buildings and whatnot. But then they didn't have enough inmates because judges didn't convict people of these quality of life offenses. And so they didn't have enough inmates. And so that ended because there was a small burial detail out there really to just secure the island up until 1985. And City Island had a lawsuit against the city because this workhouse was supposed to be fixing up the buildings, or they were going to build new buildings out there. And that's what City Island didn't want. They didn't want a huge new prison complex out there. So then it really went to hell after that. Because nobody was out there, the Department of Correction moved completely off the island, and graves were vandalized, and they had problems. The archives was set fire to, and they lost a bunch of records, really 20 years worth of records. So then they couldn't perform disinterments between 1961 and July 1977. All of those records were just gone. And that was a huge liability, but the city council didn't do anything to fix it. So, so it became evident that there was a big problem when we did a FOIL request in 2008. And we started building this database, and we realized that there was an entire grave of babies over a 9-month period where they didn't know where these bodies were. It was 1,000 missing babies, a whole grave. And so we filed a criminal complaint for mishandling human remains. And after that, the record keeping changed. It got much more accurate, and they started using GPS and whatnot. But also, as our database went online, families started discovering where their relatives were buried, and if they hadn't given permission for that, then the city would have to disinter, and sometimes people would sue the city for wrongful burial. And all of that created an issue where the city council began to look at it more carefully. And so the bill to transfer jurisdiction was first introduced in 2012, and Bloomberg wasn't interested. Then it was introduced in 2014, and de Blasio wasn't so interested. And then after Speaker Corey Johnson became interested in the AIDS burials, he put his staff on it, and they began to really work out the details of the legislation. And so now, we're still advocating that it's a very important historic cemetery, that we preserve this burial process. One of the things the city is looking at is building a crematorium out there, which is probably not cost effective because Hart Island doesn't have electricity or a gas line. So we're hoping that will kill that idea, because we want it to be a green cemetery and not a crematorium. But I will definitely be back asking for help on City Island if the city does plan to open a crematorium out there.
That would
because they would not, in
right.
order to keep up, like during a pandemic like this, it would not be 1 or 2 ovens. It would have to be a huge amount. They'd have to run it 24/7. They'd have to have people out there, all that stuff. But it's just also a huge use of fossil fuels, and really expensive to run an electric line out there just to run a crematorium with no one living out there. And I think it's much better if it's a wilderness space and a natural burial ground and kind of off the grid. So we're hoping, City Island will support it being a wilderness site, maybe with some National Park Service help, which would give the city some federal money, and also help to destigmatize this burial process so that people don't feel so bad. And also, it's the only green burial facility in the country, in the city. And so, we think New Yorkers some of them will prefer a natural burial over a cremation or paying a funeral director. It's affordable because there's no funeral director.
Yeah.
There's no middleman here. It's just straight into the ground. So we think that people will embrace it now that the penal system's not involved. And it's also, there's a lot of wildlife out there. There's a lot of birds nesting, and it's part of there's raccoons. There's a herd of deer. The deer swim back and forth, and it's just it's really nice to be in a part of New York City where there isn't electricity, and people can navigate on their phones, but it's a very peaceful location.
It is. I look out, it's actually in the back of my window, but I had, I grew up in City Island, but just had the first experience last year, and I was only able to go there through State Senator Biaggi, who was able to take me there. But exploring the island is just, I am very excited for the potential for the public to be able to be on this really unique space on or near City Island and in New York City.
Yeah, and maybe you'll have a national monument in your backyard. I mean, It's just nice. Yeah.
Are there any closing thoughts, either Barbara that you want to ask Melinda, or Melinda that you want to share with the audience as we're getting ready to end?
Well, there's one question here about, if the graves collapse, how can you identify the grave at a later date? Okay, so the GPS doesn't change. So the bodies will stay at that location, but the graves don't collapse within the 30 years. It's a little later than that. So the graves that you see that are collapsing are pre-1980. So I hope that answers the question.
We also have a question on the numbers, because I remember we said this in the when we first originally talked about the series, and the numbers were staggering. Can you go over from the 1918 fever, AIDS, and then so like the different numbers that you have of burials on the island?
Oh, well, 1918, over 20,000, AIDS epidemic. They were burying, everybody was sort of shocked that the city, was performing these common burials and whatnot, that image that went out, but that's been going on for 150 years. And really during the AIDS epidemic, when I was out there, they were burying 4 days a week and once a month for babies. So we're only, the city's only burying twice a week, I think now at this point in the pandemic. So we're not up to what the burials were during the AIDS epidemic yet. So I don't know, what's going to happen, but so the numbers are, there's been, we're adding data now, but there'll be close to, by the time we're done with the pandemic, 75,000 burials since 1980.
Somebody was just asking about how to contact to get the booklet. You could send an email to info@cityislandmuseum.org and give us your information, and we'll try to get you a booklet or put you in touch with somebody who can get you the booklet.
Yeah,
Or any
the
other
Hart Island,
information. Yeah, when we reopen the museum, we do have some documents there and a copy of Melinda's book and some old photographs and so forth. So hopefully sometime this spring, we'll be able to open up again and people can come out and see what the museum has.
Okay, or you can email us at contact@hartisland.net or fill out the form on our website. But just contact@hartisland.net should come through. And if you send me your address, I can just mail it to you.
Great. Is that it, Lauren? No more questions?
I think so.
Yeah. Okay. Terrific. Well, I learned a lot tonight, and I thought I knew a lot, but I didn't. Not as much as I know now. Thanks, Melinda. You've done a great job. Obviously,
Well,
keep up the good work.
yeah, it's a busy time on Hart Island. So I know I've been hearing from City Islanders that they're seeing a lot of activity out there, and naturally, that's during a pandemic, that's what the city's going to be doing, burying the dead.
Yeah. Isn't Cosmo the name of the ferry that goes out there?
The Michael Cosgrove.
Cosgrove, yeah.
Yeah, but the shoreline restoration, they've been using barges.
Yes, right. We see them. Yeah.
That to go out there so that they have their own way of getting there without the Department of Transportation. So that's what's been happening. That's what those barges are.
Yeah, exactly. Good. Okay, well, thank you very much for all this. This is terrific.
Welcome, everyone. Please sign up so you get on our mailing list.
Yeah.
And please join us in 2 weeks on January 25th as we welcome City Island's artists for a panel with Cheryl Brinker and Marguerite Chadwick Jr., Ron Turner, and Mary Colby. It'll be a really great panel.
And Ron Turner.
Ron Turner, yes.
Yeah, good.
So thank you, everyone.
All right, bye.
Terrific. Thank you.